Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I'm preaching this message today on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio program that is broadcast out of our radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. Continuing our study of the book of Exodus, we are in chapter 3. We'll begin reading in verse 11. And the pronouns that are in the text, the I's, make it difficult to understand what's being said. So I may refer to the person that the pronoun represents. In case you're reading along and you see that distinction, you'll know why. Exodus 3:11. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And God said, Certainly I will be with thee. And this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. Go, gather the elders of Israel together, and say unto them, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared unto me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen that which is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, and will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. And they shall hearken to thy voice, and thou shalt come, and thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt, and ye shall say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And I'll end the reading there. I don't know that I will get through all of that today, but maybe all that I need to. Okay, so turning back to the beginning of that passage, of course, remember that God had appeared to Moses, gotten his attention by a bush that was on fire, and yet it was not consumed. I think Moses, noting a supernatural thing, a bush that's on fire and isn't consumed, he thinks that it's probably got, the Lord is involved. That's my opinion why, but he turned aside to see it. He went there, he discovered through the voice of God himself that he was not to approach any closer than he was. He was to take the shoes off his feet, because the ground upon which he stood already had been made holy by the presence of God. And of course Moses was afraid and turned away from him. And then God tells him, I have seen, I've heard, I understand the sorrow of my people that are in Egypt, having been enslaved and afflicted by their taskmasters, and I'm going to deliver them out of that bondage. I am come down from where I was. He said, I am come down. So he's come down to our level. He's come near to us to help us. It reminds me of Christ, who came down and took upon himself the form of a servant in the flesh of a man. God incarnate, God being made man, made flesh, came down to our level, made himself of no reputation, and served us so that we could learn who God is and what God's like, and then to die for us, to give his life a ransom for us, to deliver us from the bondage that we are all in, a bondage to sin, to death, a bondage to the master of those things, the devil, to deliver us from all of our sorrows. When we cry to him, he hears our prayers and comes and visits with us if we cry with all of our heart. And he delivers us from all of our troubles. And this is a picture of that. But in verse 11, Moses now speaks to God. And he said, who am I to do what you're asking? You're wanting me to go to Pharaoh. Last time I know, he was seeking to kill me, or perhaps there's a new Pharaoh by then. But in either case, there was a time when Moses had been amongst the greats. He was the adopted grandson of that Pharaoh back then, and maybe there's still one. I don't know. I haven't researched Egyptian history enough to know. But he was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he, no doubt, well-educated, well-placed, studied in war and construction and all the things that go along with being of the house royal. But that had been 40 years ago. And he had murdered a man. And Egypt was against him. Not only that, but his own brethren, whom he risked his life for when he slew the Egyptian, they were against him. They didn't like him. We don't know why that is, but they didn't. Maybe because he wore the clothes of an Egyptian. We don't know. Maybe they thought he was just an Egyptian. They didn't know who he was. They did say, who art thou, that you should make yourself a judge over us. So he was going into hostile territory, and in his mind, he was nothing. The glories of Egypt he had left them behind because he esteemed the riches of Christ to be of much greater value than all the wealth of Egypt, according to what we read in the New Testament. Moses knew about the wealth of Egypt, but he'd rather have God than anything else. And so he had become a shepherd, shepherding someone else's sheep, marrying the man's daughter, raising children. He became what we would call a nobody. Well, that's what we would call him. God had not forgotten him. God knew just exactly where he was. God had used him because he had raised him in those courts, caused him to have the knowledge of the Egyptian elite. But then he also gave him the knowledge of a servant by serving Jethro and serving the sheep and serving the family of the priest of Midian, Jethro. And his whole life was about serving someone else at this point. He'd done both sides. And in that way, he reminds us of Christ, who, is God forever, always been, and yet makes himself of no reputation. He comes down to our level to serve us, making Moses the perfect type of Christ to deliver people from bondage. But more than just being a type, it makes him really what he is. Hang on just a second. So Moses, not just valuable as a type of Christ, but in and of himself, given his upbringing in Egypt and then his further upbringing in Midian. So both the upbringing of a prince of Egypt and then the upbringing of a servant and shepherd out in the wilderness area of Midian is among all people the most uniquely qualified to do God's work of bringing his people out of Egyptian bondage. Now, it doesn't seem that he would be, but it must have been because God chose him. It's interesting that he says, in fact, it speaks volumes when he says in verse 11, who am I that I should do this? Now, see, that's exactly what I would expect a man of God who God has called to do something, not just to say, but to totally feel deep in his heart. A servant of God a true servant of God is very meek. And God requires meekness on our part. He resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And the servants of God need all the grace they can get. And their humility is something that God greatly values. And in their humility, because he values that, because they're not proud, he lifts them up through the assignments that he gives them. Hopefully, that they will become lifted up in their own estimation, but lifted up by reason of the office to which he has appointed them. Who am I? And last week I think we read where it said that, now the man Moses was meek above all the other people on the earth. The meekest man living is who God chose to do this. There's a passage that you might want to turn to. I'm trying to find it. In 1 Corinthians, just talking about, generally speaking, the type of people that God chooses. There's a lot of people that choose to go into this ministry. They choose to become preachers, and they choose to do this and that in the service of God, but actually they can choose all they want. If God didn't choose them to the task, then God did not call them to that task, and he does not send them to that task. And he has a problem with people that run where he doesn't tell them to run, and do when he doesn't tell them to do, and to say when he doesn't tell them to say. You must be called of God to do these things, or you're not his servant. But who he picks, they're not great men. In fact, they're spoken of pretty harshly in 1 Corinthians. And we can read in verse 26 of the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul's description of such people. He says, "For you see your calling," meaning you are called, brethren, "how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the mighty. And base things," it means common, very ordinary and low, base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are naught, or things that are nothing, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no flesh should glory in God's presence. See, Moses, by his very nature, would not think highly of himself because God had given them this job to do. In fact, he sees himself as totally unqualified. Who is he, a shepherd man, to go down to Egypt, to Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world, with the most powerful army in the world, and extreme wealth, probably the richest man on earth, to buy a poor nobody, shepherd, not even of his own sheep, to come in here and demand that he release all these people, God's people, from bondage. And he first off seems to question his own self. Who am I? I'm not qualified. But I think he also questions whether or not it's possible that he could do it. And God's answer seems to suggest that God understood that. Now, in the King James Version, which is translated out of the Masoretic text, it says, "And God says, certainly I will be with thee." Then there's a semicolon, and it says, "And this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Now, I've told you that as we go through the Old Testament, frequently I'll turn to the Septuagint, which was written from an earlier Hebrew text and translated now into English about 200 years ago. And it's much older than the text used to translate the King James. And I think it's clear to me what God says to Moses at this time regarding, who am I to do this? And so that says in, let me see if I can find it here. Upon which God spake to Moses, saying, that I will be with thee. Even this is the sign for thee. Period. So he's saying, now he wasn't asking for a sign. He's just saying, who am I? But like I say, I think it connotes that he's also, I'm not up to this task. I can't do it. And God said, well, here's a sign for you. He volunteers a sign. I will be with thee. Now see, if God is for us, who can be against us? And Moses there, standing on holy ground, made holy by the very presence of God, who was still there and emanating light from a bush that was not consumed, though it was on fire, his very presence lighting the place and sanctifying the place. And Moses is so afraid he has to turn his back because he's fearful of dying from the very presence of God. He's hearing God say, I will be with you. I am with you, and I will be with you. This is a sign. See, that's the sign. The King James makes it think the sign is that you wind up at Mount Sinai. He's saying, I'm with you. That's all the sign you need from me. That's the proof that you can do this. But then he goes further and he says, let me see. He says, and, a new sentence, and because I will send thee, therefore when thou hast brought my people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Now that's the Septuagint. Now, so what he's saying is, I am with you, and I'm going to be with you. That's all you need to know about whether or not you're qualified. I will make you qualified. And so it is, if you're called to preach. God makes you a preacher. Now you have to study and all that to show yourself approved to God, but God preaches through you if you're truly called. I don't feel like I'm called right now. Sometimes I feel like I am, though. I know I am called. I mean, it's just sometimes I don't preach like a preacher ought to. This is more of a Sunday school lesson. But I should stop talking about myself. But now, in addition to giving the assurance that he's going to be with him, he says, oh, and you're going to succeed. Because he's saying also, when you bring them up, you're going to worship with them right here on this very mountain where this burning bush is at the time. So he's saying, I'm going to be with you, Moses, and you will succeed in that to which I have called you. So now, I'm going to again turn to the Septuagint and try to find it faster. So now Moses responds to God, according to the Septuagint, the older translation. It says, then Moses said to God, behold, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of our fathers hath sent me to you, and they shall say, what is his name? What shall I say to them? On which God spoke to Moses, saying, I am the I am. Moreover, he said, thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, the I am hath sent me to you. Again, God said to Moses, thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, the Lord. Well, I'll get to that later. So what we have here is, in the King James it says, you tell them, I am sent you. I am that I am. Here in the Septuagint, it's translated, the I am sent you. So, and there's other places it says, where it's translated, I am who I am. Now, this may seem like nothing, but it's probably going to take the rest of this sermon to talk about. So, just because I'm not very good at speaking. God, when we're going to talk about the name of God. Now, in Abraham's time, now God has repeatedly mentioned Abraham. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God of your father also, your daddy, Abraham. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I'm that God. Now, Abraham, when he was up on the mountain to offer Isaac, and then God, of course, spares Isaac, and he prepares an altar, and God provides a lamb, and they slay the lamb and makes the offering to God, and Isaac's spared. Abraham called God Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord provides. And Jehovah being a translation of a word, I believe, and I'm not a scholar on this, it's Adonai. It means Lord. Okay, the Lord. So the Lord that provides. God provided the sacrifice. The Lord provided a means whereby Abraham did not have to slay his son. He spared Abraham's son, but his own son he did not spare, but delivered him up for us all. So Jehovah. Now you'll find Jehovah throughout the Old Testament. You'll also find the word Lord being applied, not always to God, but many times to God. And in some Bible translations, when you have that word Adonai in the Old Testament, I think it's about 5,000 times that he's mentioned to as by Adonai. It's that all four words, Lord, L-O-R-D, are capitalized, so we'll understand that that's what that word is. It's a reference to God. That Lord that's all capped like that is a reference to God. The Jews didn't want to pronounce I am. And to this day, the faithful, pious Jews they won't use his name. Probably because in the commandment it says, thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord, the Lord thy God in vain. Well, I want to make sure they don't want to do that. They just don't even pronounce his name. They may say some vain things, and no doubt they do, but they don't use his name in vain. And so instead of using his name, they used a description, which was Lord, Adonai. They could say Adonai, and by that they mean the Lord. Now when they're reading something like this, where it says, I am that I am, they won't say that. They'll say the name. They just say the name. That way they're not using his name. And it's a sign of respect, but I think it also has to do with fear of using his name in a vain manner. I don't think God says, thou shalt not use my name, but they choose not to. So the name given, I am that I am, in the first place in verse 14 is not really a name. He's just responding to Moses saying, who shall send you? He does not say, tell him that my name is I am, I am. He doesn't say that. At first he just says, I am that I am, or I am the I am. And he says, thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, I am, or the I am, according to the Septuagint, hath sent me unto you. Now that word, I am, is formed in the Hebrew text of four consonants. It's JHVH, or maybe it's YHVH. And you cannot pronounce English words. I don't know about other languages, but English words can't be pronounced without the use of vowels. In fact, so there's vowels and their consonants. You understand that A, E, I, O, and U, sometimes Y, are used as vowels and everything else is a consonant. Now, like a consonant would be the letter K. But even saying the letter in the alphabet K, you have to use the consonant A, K. See how you do it? So even to speak a letter by itself, not much less a word, we have to use vowels. But in the Hebrew writing, they used consonants without the vowels. And they would put little marks on there to indicate how it was spoken verbally by people at the time, but the written word was consonants only. But it means the same. It means I am that, or who, or the I am. And whatever it means, however it was pronounced, or however it's spelled, or whatever, the meaning of it is self-existence. Now that's what I want us to talk about if we got a little bit more time. Self-existence. God existed before anything else ever existed. In the beginning, God is what we read in the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God. That shows God was when everything else began. And not only that, but it shows his pivotal role in it. He says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And eventually shows how everything that exists was created by God other than God himself. So God is self-existence. He is not derived or from anything else. He's not created by something else. There is nothing else to create him. Before, see, in other words, if God created all, then there was nothing before him that could have created him. Children and other atheists, I should say atheists and other children, might ask the question, well, who created God? And the answer is, nobody created God. God created everything. All created things were created by God. But God was not created. God always was. Speaking about Melchizedek, back in Genesis, when Abraham made tithes and offering after the slaughter of this king, it says that, it's talking about Melchizedek. If you go to Hebrews, it defines him. It says, having neither father nor mother, nor beginning of days, nor end of life. And the Hebrew writer says that Jesus is that Melchizedek. Neither father, meaning in his pre-incarnate form, no father, no mother, no beginning, no end. He's always been. He is self-existent. So, trying to get my head around what to say, and particularly to those of you who don't believe in God, or are unsure of it, or have been led astray by all the lies that are in this world of darkness that tell us that there is no accounting to be made. There's no life after death. You won't have to pay the price unless someone catches you doing something that requires punishment. But God exists. See, the very description that he gives of himself, I am. And it is the description, but later on he says, the Lord, and the Lord meaning it's a name. And he said, now this is going to be my name forever for you, a memorial to you. So not only does he give a name, but he said it's the Lord. But even that spelling also would mean I am. It's a quirky little thing. But we're able to call him Lord, and we do. But he is the I am. He is the one that is self-existent. The fact that he says I am is counterposed to all the lies of this world. Lies that would say that, like the Egyptians, that the sun, Ra, that was God. No, God made the sun. Or they say, well, this beetle, this scarab, that's God. No, God made the beetle. Well, the Nile, the Nile that gives us all the water and all of our food and all that, we'll worship the Nile. And they did worship all these things and many more. God says, no, I made the Nile and everything that's in it. And the food that you eat, that came from me. The air that you breathe, that comes from me. The sunlight that lights the day, the moonlight that lights the night, the oceans, the fish, you name it. I made you. Through your parents, your first parents, you are procreated in their image. Everything you've got, I made. The fact that he is self-existent means that he is foundational. He is the bedrock from whom all other existence is derived. Meaning everything but God is secondary in nature. Secondary through causation. Nothing caused God. There was nothing to cause God. But God himself And I can't even say when he decided to, because to say when indicates time. But God created time, and he's going to end time according to the Bible. In the beginning, on day one, there was time. That's what it says. And he coming back, he's going to say, time shall be no more. God exists outside of time and space and matter and energy. All those things I just said, those are creatures that he made. Time is not a living, breathing creature, but it's a servant of God. And he used it to serve us too. He's created it for our benefit. So is space. The great expanse, the firmaments he speaks of there in Genesis. He made the space. There was no space before God. People want to think that there was no God and there was this vast universe and there was no God. Then all of a sudden someone had to make God so that he would be over it. No. In the beginning, the only thing that existed, I'm saying in the beginning, before the beginning, outside of creation, all that ever existed was God. And everything else derives from him. When he says, I am that I am, let's turn around, let's talk, I'll talk about me again, but just as an example. If I were to speak to myself in a similar phraseology, I would say, I am that which was born of Basil and Azalee Ambrose, that which was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, that which was educated at Kingsbury and Memphis State University, that which served in the Army as an officer, that which that eventually ran power plants to make electricity, and that which is now retired. In other words, we'd have to add all these qualifiers to show how I became what I am. Because I wouldn't have been at all had my parents not had me. Okay? And I wouldn't have grown if I had not been fed. And I wouldn't have grown mentally if I had not been educated. I would not have grown experientially had I not been in the military and in the industry that I chose. In other words, I'm constantly becoming something else, something greater or worse, depending on how you live your life, because of that which happens to me that did not come from me. But God has always been exactly what he is now. What he is now is what he was. What he is now is what he will be. There is no changing to him. There's no beginning. There's no ending. He is reality itself. He brought all real things other than himself into existence. He brought rocks into existence. He created them. He brought lightning. He brought fire. He brought the sun. He brought the stars. He brought the earth. He brought the planets. He brought all chemicals, all methodologies for reckoning time and calendars. All those things came from him. But he does not come from any of them. He is completely independent. His existence depends and never has depended on anything else other than his own self. Unlike us, which, as I just said in my illustration of myself, I depend totally upon the circumstances that surround me from conception until death. It's all done to me. I might have some influence on it, but it wouldn't happen if it weren't for these other factors. I would not be who I am, but God always is who he is, unchangeable. And not only unchangeable, but perfect. He's perfect in every way. He's the absolute standard of everything true, of everything that is right, of everything that's good, He's the standard of what life itself is. The life that He gave to man, it says, was in His own image. He gave us an image like unto Himself. And so our life, unique from the animals, is like God's, but it's not derived from ourselves. It was something given us by God. He is the standard. And so in the world to come, to be able to be where He is eternally, we have to be way more like Him than we are down here. So we have to be conformed, the Bible teaches us, to the very image of His Son, so that we might be likened to Him. And He does that also, because we can't. And, these ideas about, this vast universe and then somehow someone must have made God. Now, that's not true. They're trying to lie to you and make sure that we don't understand things. But everything that there is sprang from God. And if He chooses to end it, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's His to do with as He chooses. It's His personal possession. All things are mine, He says. All the gold, all the silver, the cattle on 1,000 hills, everything is mine. I made it. He made you too. And the fact that He sits here and He tells us that He is. If you could, particularly if you're lost, you need to understand that if He wasn't, if there wasn't God, then there is no true arbiter of what is righteous, what is good or what is bad, what is evil or what is holy. There is no, it's just up for everybody to decide. So if you want to go kill somebody, well, why not? Who has the moral authority to tell you no? Some other person? Where did they get that from? Why is it wrong to steal? Well, because God said so. That's it. There is no other reason. You can say, like atheists do, that man created these laws just so that we can survive as a species. Well, we don't see animals creating law, and yet they survive as a species. The lilies of the field don't have any laws like that. They have no rules, but they survive. Why couldn't people survive as a species without laws? Don't be ridiculous. There is a fundamental difference between God and man. God is free from any and all constraints. Nobody can make Him do a thing. But because He is who He is, He does all things that He does perfectly. His every thought is pure. His every intent comes to pass. He does exactly what is right. Exactly when He should do it, as long as time exists, which He will bring to a stop. So we can't really even think about it. But if you're lost, understand that God is. And He's watching. He told Moses, I have seen what the Egyptians are doing to my people. I've heard my people's cry. I understand. I see their sorrow. I'm come down to help them. He tells us that every idle word will be brought into judgment. Every idle thought and deed, every wicked thing, every lust, everything that we all are, which is just a bag of sin, God is, He sees, and He will judge. The fact that He is who He is, the supreme and only supreme being of all things having come from Him. We should understand then, and we don't. We don't think about it. We think, well, what about my house? Well, what about my car? What about my job? What about my money? What about my wife? What about it? They're all secondary. They don't mean a thing. But it comes right down to it, except what they might mean to God who created it. You see, it's His interest that prevails. He cannot be constrained to do anything. He cannot be prevented from doing something he wants to do. He is the most valuable and important, in fact, the only truly valuable and important person in existence. Acts 17:28 gives us some idea. Paul talking to the Athenians, I believe. It says, speaking of God, it says, for in him we live, in him we move, in him we have our being. Everything that we have came from him. And concerning us, if you took all the heavens and all the planets, stars, asteroids, comets, nebulae, everything in this world all bundled together, just as an old tiny speck of a dirt, a planet, amongst all the vastness that God created. But you put all that together, time and space and energy and all those creatures that God created for his pleasure, just because he wanted to. You put them all together. And God tells us through the prophet Isaiah that they don't amount to a single thing, except in so much that they have a value to God, they are nothing. In Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 17, hear what God tells the prophet to tell us. All nations before God are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing. A vanity, meaning a futility. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare unto him? And people have been making God out of idols forever. I have not preached this very well, and I'm sorry for that, but if there's one thing I want you to get from this lesson, is when God reveals who he is, it sounds mysterious. In fact, it is mysterious. No one agrees as to what those four letters, those four consonants means completely. They all have to, and people have been studying this for 3,500 years. And the entire effort of the human race has not come up with a consensus answer. And we would think, well, why would we do that? It just says, I am that I am. Well, it's because it entails so much. Because there's a God, and that God has established rules, unless you abide by the rules, it says he has established what punishment he's going to make. You will be held accountable by the God that is and was and shall be. He will punish you with great wrath if you refuse to yield to him. If this God, and there's no if about it, God is so great, the creator of all things, the self-existent God, which alone is fundamental and primary, and everything else balled into one is in no way, not even a speck, not a drop in the bucket. In one place it says in the Bible. And yet, that little drop in the bucket, you and me, this whole world, all of history, all of humankind, by the mass we have rejected him, we have made fun of him, we have blasphemed him, we have sinned against him. It is our very nature. Ever since the fall of man, our first parents sinned and we born sinners, that we treat God with contempt, upon whom our entire existence hangs, and our futurity. What will become of us when we lay down in death in this soil that we came from, because God scooped up the soil and formed us, formed our first parent, Adam, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So we all became living souls before God and accountable to him for what we do. And yet, he is despised and rejected of men. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our face from him. We counted him nothing. And before I leave this, and I'm already a little bit over long, but I'll finish this off by saying this very term, I am, I exist, was well known to the Jews. They wouldn't even speak it for fear of speaking it in vain. There was a time in the Gospel according to John in chapter 8 where the Pharisees were constantly fighting with Jesus. And he tells them, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And he saw it and was glad. Then said the Jews unto Jesus, thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. He used that holy name that he gave to Moses at the burning bush to explain that he exists today before Abraham existed 3,500 years ago. There is no beginning and ending to him. Understand who it is that you're fighting against if you're lost, and who you're trying to worship if you're saved. That's all I have.